I saw something that intrigued me recently, so I figured I'd put my 2 cents worth in on it, even though it's not my normal area. But I do have a background in history. I have a history degree, so I know a little bit about how to research this type of stuff. But anyway, it started off with a channel putting up a video with a very primitive matchlock firearm called a handgun or a hand cannon, and it would have been probably a 14th century firearm in Europe. Okay, that's good. But it was just an entertainment channel. It was Kentucky Ballistics. So, predictably, his video about an armor being able to, about a handgun or a ye old hand cannon, as he called it, being able to defeat a knight's armor, got a reaction from the medieval channels, what I would refer to as the sword nerds, kind of affectionately, actually. But the sword nerd channels made the obvious assertion that wasn't real armor he was using. That was some sort of costume grade. It might have been aluminum. They were all putting in their flair on it. But instead of doing a 35, 45-minute video like they did of not knowing anything about the firearms, but talking about how the armor wasn't right, I do know something about the firearms. I don't have any exactly perfect replicas for that time period, but I have something that's analogous, so I did some testing. First test I started with was with a shorter barreled firearm. In this case, it's a flintlock pistol. But while the ignition system and this particular style pistol was not accurate to that time period, what was accurate is that this is smoothbore, and it is of a bore diameter that would have been available in those firearms, because they went all the way up to about what we would consider 80 caliber today. About 8 bore is what they probably would have called it back then. But anyway, this one is 69 caliber. It's made to fire the same projectiles as my Charleville musket. So I'm going to use 69 caliber, 680 round balls for all these tests, just out of different length barrels. The 680 round balls are going to be soft lead. I have some in a jar right here. And as you can see, they're China marble sized. They're just about an ounce of lead. They're 460 grains on average. There's about 15 of these to a pound. So, the first test, as mentioned, we started with 120 grains of black powder, which would have been a very small charge for what they would have used in that time period, because they generally went with a weight of powder equal to the weight of the ball. So they would have had like 460 grains of powder in this, which would have been significant. And I didn't proof this barrel to that, so I did not want to do that. So the first test, I did 120 grains. And on mild steel, which in this case was about 80 thousandths of an inch thick, so about 2 millimeters, which was very comparable to the early, thus the 14th century plate armor, and the thickest places on it. Now, these short barrels, could they go through that? Let's find out. The second test I did, which also didn't go through, was using 240 grains of powder in this. And it really kicks hard when you do that. Well, now, that's interesting. As you can see, it put some big, huge dents in this plate. But it did not go through it. And this is about 2 millimeter mild steel. Approximately akin to what a heavy breastplate would be for most people when you do that. So the early handguns probably could not go through the heaviest of plate armor. But plate armor was really just coming into its own at that time period, and it probably wasn't quite as prevalent. So it depends on what you were wearing, and depends on how good it was. It depends on how good the person who was making it was. Kind of, do you feel lucky? Now, we get to the interesting part, which is where I started to test the musket. This musket is also 69 caliber. It's a flintlock. But again, the ignition system is not what we're testing. I know matchlock muskets do work. They do light off and they do fire the ball. So really, what we're testing is the barrel and the projectile. And again, we're using soft lead. We're not using a hardened projectile of any sort, though they did actually use iron projectiles as well as lead alloys that have been found archaeologically on battlefields. So it's definitely possible that they used a more potent projectile than the soft lead that I was using. But when I used this longer barrel of this musket with 120 grains of powder, the difference was quite a bit compared to the pistol. Looks like the musket did the job. So, since this successfully lasted right on through that mild steel piece, which it was a different piece than what I showed on the other one, but it was cut from the same section of steel and it was the same thickness. I did attempt to harden it. It did not harden. It is just mild steel. It was maybe 10-20 on the Rockwell scale. I found examples in the 15th and 16th century, which would have been facing the longer arquebus and matchlocks and muskets that came out later. And at that point in time, they were hardening armor. And there was a broad range of hardnesses, and the broad range of hardnesses even on one piece, and just like the thicknesses of it. So to give it the very best chance, I decided to do two examples. One was hardened to the hardest specification that I could find, was that they found one piece that measured up to 55 on the HRC scale. That's right. There's different scales for different materials. But anyway, 55 is very hard for something that's going to be taking an impact. So let's see how that turned out with the musket. It's about 3 mils thick, and it's hardened to 55 HRC, hardened and then tempered back to 55. And it's been tested with a Rockwell hardness tester. There's a little divot right in there, a little point where I tested it, and there's another one over on the other side. I tested it in like 3 or 4 places. Well, let's see if we can find it. Well, I'm not sure if we count that as a win or not. The plate shattered. So I don't think 55 HRC is a good plate hardness. I've got good structure, nice fine grain. But it's too hard to be a protective plate, apparently. It just became part of the projectile. Scraps of it stuck in the back of the plastic barrel. There's actually little bits of it inside, and even stuck in this plastic back here are parts of the plate. So now that shattered into tiny little pieces. I gathered up as many of them as I could find, and I kind of tried to reassemble them. I'll put in a picture of what that looks like. But as you can see, that probably wouldn't be a good idea to have armor that's hardened that much. It might be a little too brittle. So, went to something a little bit more in the middle of the road. I had another piece that it was only about 42 Rockwell once I ground into the interior of it. And that stopped the musket. Modern, and I think it is some sort of abrasion resistant steel like what we use for actual shooting targets, and it is a little thicker probably than 3mm. This would be very heavy armor, but as you can see, I've got a big splat of lead that hit it that did not at all look like it was going to go through that plate. So I guess it's possible Of course, I was only using 120 grain powder charge. We can up that a little bit, but I don't think it's good. Alright, heavy grains. I sure wouldn't have felt good. Well, the plate landed back here, about 5 feet in front of where the barrel was. And the barrel landed back there, about 10 feet behind where it was. But it didn't go through the plate. This is a much more significant dent in the steel. And that even stopped the musket with 240 grains of powder in the musket. Now again, I did not jump up to the 460 grains that they would have probably used with this size barrel. Mostly because I don't trust this to be safe with it, and they blew up a lot of barrels themselves. Another way that the armor debate depends on what's shooting at you and what you're wearing. Not just that your armor could be different thicknesses and different hardnesses in various places on it. So you're depending a little bit on your luck of where you get hit in the armor. Let's not forget that this was commonly used later on, but arquebus very similar to this in dimensions that fired a very similar ball would have been commonly used by groups such as the Landsneck mercenaries, and the Spanish were very fond of them. And there were examples of the Spanish. One particular battle, I have a note on it here. It was in Italy, and I'm not sure if I'll pronounce it correctly. Cerignola. It's an Italian town. The Spanish were being chased by the French, and they turned around to fight in 1503. And apparently they managed to catch the French heavy cavalry trying to cross a depressed road. So they basically had to go through a ditch and up a little berm that the arquebusiers had thrown up. And they got absolutely mauled trying to go through there, as well as the heavily armed Swiss pikemen that were following them. So that was heavy cavalry in the 1500s, when they would have been wearing, that's the 16th century, when they would have been wearing heavier armor. And like I said, it didn't turn out well for the heavy cavalry. So we do know that muskets could penetrate armor. It probably depended exactly on the quality of your armor. And again, you bit your luck as to where you got hit on the armor, as to whether if it was one of the too hard places, the too soft places, the places that are just right, the places that are thick enough, or the places that are too thin. So again, it really depended where you got hit and how. And let's not forget that this was considered the light weapon of the day. They had what they considered a heavy arquebus that came in. Let's see, when did heavy arquebus come about? Oh, the 16th century, about 1521, so right around then. And a heavy arquebus could fire a round that was not just an ounce of lead, but up to 3.5 ounces of lead, and sometimes more. That would be more equivalent to my 4-bore blunderbuss that I have, which I didn't take out to test the armor with. But it was designed, and those weapons were designed to be either a 2-man team or to be on wagons. And they were intended to destroy armor, to punch through knights in armor. So could a handgun, a hand cannon, defeat armor? Well, it probably could defeat some of the armor of its time. The arquebus could defeat most of the armor of its time. And the later heavy arquebus pretty much is the reason people stopped wearing armor.